Sciences Po.
Dear professors Stiglitz, Bourguignon, and Fitoussi, Madame la directrice, chère Martine Durand, Monsieur le doyen, cher Yann Algan, Mesdames et Messieurs les professeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers amis, and of course, dear students, please allow me first of all to express our deepest concern and also our utmost solidarity for Fariba Adelkha and Roland Marchal, our two colleagues and friends who've been arbitrarily and unjustly imprisoned in Iran for now over 5 months, for exactly 152 days, for no other crime than trying to do their job as academics. With the help of the French authorities, Sciences Po is doing its utmost to provide Fariba and Roland with all the support and all the help that they need. And we also try to make their ordeal come to as quick a conclusion as possible. But they are in our hearts at all time. Any decision maker, if he or she is to make the best decision, must have tools and indicators at hand that give him or her a true picture of reality, all the more so when facing the urgency and severity of a crisis. We're fortunate to have with us today several distinguished representatives of the OECD high-level expert group who, over the past 5 years, have been on a mission to answer a very important question. How can we better measure wealth? Joseph Stiglitz, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, François Bourguignon, Martine Durand, Yann Algan have done us the great pleasure and honor of accepting to share with us this evening the main insights from their research, which takes the form of 2 volumes. And I believe this is, in fact, tonight the very first presentation of this work that is done in France. And so we're very happy that this is taking place at Sciences Po. The initial observation, which forms the basis for their reflection, is quite clear. For more effective public policy, we need to move beyond the indicator of gross domestic product and to produce and to use better, that is to say, more appropriate data on the economy and the well-being of the population. Many economists, many policymakers, many observers, researchers, and citizens agree that collectively we have placed too much importance on GDP as an indicator of the health of economies and societies. As Jean-Paul Fitoussi has rightly illustrated, an earthquake that entails reconstruction or a spike in violence that boosts sales of alarm systems may well increase GDP, but clearly not well-being. To give another example, and it will be easy to find many more, according to IMF and World Bank data, Belgium and Argentina had the same GDP in the year 2018 of around $500 billion. But it's not hard to see that there is almost no comparison possible between the economic situations of Belgium and Argentina, and that GDP alone tells us nothing about the state of inequalities, of people's perceptions, of their situation and well-being, of their health, their skills, their safety, the educational system in which they live, or the environmental sustainability of the system in which they are placed. Of course, these ideas are not new. The severity of the 2008 financial crisis and its serious economic and social consequences led then French President Nicolas Sarkozy, keen to escape what he called the religion of figures, to ask 2 of tonight's guests, Jean-Paul Fitoussi and Joe Stiglitz, together with Amartya Sen, to reflect on ways to avoid an overly quantitative accounting-based approach to measuring our collective performance and to develop new indicators for wealth and social progress. The research which we are here to discuss today is all the more important now that the imperatives of the ecological transition and the seriousness of the climate crisis are no longer in doubt. For years, the figures showed ever-increasing economic growth, but it then became clear that growth, by endangering the future of the planet, was destroying more than it was creating. Our world, our society, our economies have changed profoundly, while the indicators with which we measure these changes have remained indexed to GDP. This is precisely why I believe that your work, mesdames et messieurs, deserves, is especially important, that it goes way beyond the field of economics. It serves to consolidate democracy in that it tackles head-on the feeling that some citizens may have that the authorities have been deceiving them in using, if not manipulating, figures that are a poor reflection of the reality which they experience. Better tools and better indicators that go beyond GDP would not only make it possible to assess the true health of a country, its economy, and the living conditions of its population, but would also help to restore the trust of citizens in their institutions and in the decisions taken by their representatives. One just needs to see how many students have flocked into this lecture theater tonight to grasp the relevance of this topic. And so again, I would like to express my great thanks to you, Madame, Messieurs, for being with us tonight. And without further ado, I will yield this microphone to Martine Durand. Enjoy the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci. Merci. Thank you very much. Bonsoir. Et bonsoir d'être venus aussi nombreux ce soir ici. So it's my pleasure to start this conversation with you, we hope. We're going to make a show. So here we are, the comedians on stage. We'll try to make it as entertaining as possible. So let me start by, I will introduce the project, this project, which, and first of all, I want to thank the director. Just thank you very much for your kind words of introduction, Mr. Mion. So again, we're very pleased to present the work that has been conducted over 5 years by what is called the high-level group on measuring what counts for economic and social performance, or also known as the HLEG group. What we'll do is that I'm going to introduce the work that we've been doing over, I'll provide some context, although the director has already provided a lot of context. And then each of us will present some aspects of the work that has been conducted and has been published under these two big reports. So obviously we're not going to cover everything. Otherwise we'll be here for 2 or 3 hours. So let me start right away. And just to recall and repeat what the director has just said, this high-level expert group that started its work in 2013 is actually really a direct follow-up to the work carried out by the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, the so-called SSF, or Stiglitz Fitoussi Commission, which was established, as was just said, by President Sarkozy, and the report was published in 2009 under a title which was called Mismeasuring Our Life. And the key message really is just what was said, is GDP is not a measure of well-being. GDP measures a lot of things, such as the production of goods and services during a certain period in a country, but certainly is not a good measure of well-being. And in particular for policies, because that's what we're interested in here, domestic policies, it cannot be considered as as an end in itself. It's a means to achieve this end, which is to improve the well-being of the population, but too often is being considered as actually an end in itself. So that was one of the key messages of this SSF report, which argued that we needed to take into account a number of non-economic factors that shape people's quality of life that are not accounted for in GDP. And in particular, one really great disadvantage of GDP or a shortcoming of GDP is that it says nothing about how the income that results from this production is distributed across population groups, and nothing about its sustainability and, of course, environmental sustainability in particular. But also, as was just recalled, nothing about the health system, the health of the population, the quality of the education, and so on and so forth. So, to follow up on the work that had been carried out by the Commission, Professor Stiglitz and Professor Fitoussi thought there were lots of subjects that needed to be explored further, and they were interested in creating a new group, an independent group that could pursue that work. And they came to the OECD, and at the OECD we said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's host this group, because we can learn a lot, and that can, of course, provide a great input into what the OECD is doing, which is to provide advice to governments. So this group was set up, and 2 reports were released. One report, which is the green one, which is a summary of our work over 5 years by the 3 co-chairs, and then the yellow, the orange or pink, or I don't know, colored one is actually a collection of chapters by some members of the high-level group on specific topics, which we are going to present in a minute. So who were the members of the group, of this group? You have the list here.
Version polonaise.
And this is a Polish version of the first book. It's just hot off the press. We received it today directly from Poland. So some of the members of the group were the same as the members of the commission, the earlier commission, but others joined, in particular Jan Algan, Professor Algan, but also Thomas Piketty, whom you will know, and a number of others, including not just economists, I should say, but political scientists, statisticians, and psychologists and sociologists, which was also true for the first commission, but I think we made a case that it should be a very varied group of people, and in particular coming from various disciplines. So I'll just start with this, and then I'll give the floor to Joe Stiglitz in a moment. But from the 2 reports, I would say there are 2 key messages that come out. Of course, it's, as was said, if to inform policymaking, you have to have good indicators and good measures. Plus, you have to use them appropriately. But so you will see in the report that there's lots about measurement, how to improve our measurements, our metrics. Because what you measure, it's argued in the report, really affects what you do. If there are things that you don't measure, it looks like the problem does not exist. Or if you measure the wrong thing, then you will do the wrong thing. So it's very important to focus on the measures that are needed to make decision-making, good decision-making. But it's not just an issue of measures. Indeed, it's an issue about policies. It's not just technical, although the book is very technical. It goes beyond the technicalities because, as I think the director just reminded us, it goes really at the roots of our democratic system. If you don't trust the measures, then you can always argue that other things can be done, and that really has an impact on the way the democratic system, the whole story of fake news, you've heard that, of course, many times. And whether, indeed, you can, the policymakers can reconnect to the concerns of ordinary people. If you measure what matters to people, you have a better chance to addressing the concerns of people. If you don't measure what matters to people, you ignore what is important to people. And I don't have to, we'll come back to that, I'm sure. The story in France, the recent events on the yellow vests are testimony to this sort of concerns. So the main themes of the report was, we started our work in 2013, and we were just coming out, or it looked like we were coming out of the crisis. So there was an idea of, are we measuring well the effects of the crisis, and we wanted to dig deeper into that. Second, we wanted to go deeper into the analysis of themes that were already covered in the first report, but needed further investigation, such as the whole issue of inequalities, the issue of perceptions and subjective well-being, the issue of sustainability. But there was, since the SSF, new issues had emerged, and the group decided also to investigate into the issue of inequality of opportunity, not just inequality of outcome. The the whole issue of economic insecurity, and of course very relevant in the context of the crisis, but also the issue of trust, the issue of resilience, because those were concerns that weigh heavily on people's daily life. And finally, there is a chapter as well to say that all this is good, but so what? You know, you may have all this information, you may have a very good diagnosis, but if you don't act on it, then you have done only part of the job. So we wanted to have a chapter at the end, which is kind of a call for policymakers to use those metrics and encourage the use of well-being metrics, and what are the barriers to actually using those metrics. So with this context, I'd now like to give the floor to Professor Stiglitz to talk to us, complement what I just said, of course, and talk to you about the crisis in particular.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both. Your great introduction. You actually saved us talking about the whole thing. You gave us. You could have been on the panel instead. And Martine has laid out the overall perspective. And I do want to take this occasion to thank the OECD for their real support in this. I mean, when you undertake a project like this, it takes a lot of support. Academics are flying all over the world and trying to get them to stop for a minute in Paris or some other place, and then keep the momentum going is really difficult, and I think they've done a fantastic job. I also want to encourage you, the OECD had already been doing work along many of the lines that we're talking about, and they have a wonderful website called the Better Living Index.
Better Life Index.
Better Life Index, and it has tools by which you can see how different countries are doing in different dimensions. And what it tries to point out, you can use that to say if you really care about X or one thing or another, you can get a view about how different countries are doing in those dimensions. So it's a very flexible and a very useful tool and an extraordinary database that I think is useful for both citizens and researchers. I want to just reiterate a couple points that Martine made. A lot of what we're going to be talking about are one of the reasons we were interested in this is the impact on policy. As Martine said, what you measure affects what you do. And too often, we don't think about the measurements and how they bias our decision-making. And this afternoon, you'll get a lot of examples of real-life examples of where that is going on. Just to give you, just one example, governments are always focused on spending, but don't talk about the benefits of those spending. So you'll have a government that says, we need to cut retirement programs. And they'll talk about the savings in the dollars, or euros here. They'll talk about the savings in euros, but they won't talk about the impact on the insecurity of individuals' lives. And because we don't measure insecurity in our GDP. So you get a distorted view. In the environment, it's the same thing. You'll often hear if we impose an environmental regulation like cars can't have more emissions than a certain level, or they have to be a certain level of fuel efficiency. You'll hear people talk about the impact on GDP, but they won't mention that it enables our world to survive. And so you get a biased view because you see the cost, but you don't see the benefit. And our statistics often don't include that. More broadly, an example that I'm going to talk about, and probably Jean-Paul, we talk a lot about government debt. Everybody focuses on debt. No company would ever talk about just their debt. They want to know your debt is your liability side of your balance sheet, but there's another side called your assets. And if you look at just the liabilities, of course things look terrible. But you have to ask, what are the assets? And so thinking about that really gives you a different way of framing policy. So maybe this is sort of an obsession of mine, but we have a problem in the United States called the president. And we had, I know, this is not political, this is just a fact. And so I'm trying to stay away from, but it is an obsession. So we had a tax bill in December 2017. And there were clear liabilities associated with it. The U.S. deficit this year is going to be almost $1 trillion. Remarkable in peacetime, in a period when the economy is close to full employment. So, you know, when I hear other countries talk about deficits, I just can't take it seriously. You should be embarrassed at how low your deficit is. But the point I wanted to make is there was nothing on the asset side. It was an increase in the liability to give a tax cut to the billionaires who are suffering so much everywhere in the world, and our large corporations who have not been paying taxes anyway, and they will pay even less taxes now. So that's an example where if you had looked at the liability and the asset side, you would say, what are you doing in enacting this tax bill? So this is going to be a recurrent theme this evening of more comprehensive metrics will give us a broader sense of what is going on, and therefore, what are the trade-offs? Now, some things are very hard to measure, and we have to be open about that, and that was one of the reasons that our original commission said you shouldn't use a single number, you should use a dashboard. You know, how can you add up the fact that our society has higher life expectancy now, in general, although most of you may know that life expectancy in the United States is declining ever since Trump became the president. It's correlation, I'm sure, not causation, but there is an increase in anxiety and sleeplessness and lots of other consequences. But how do you add up life expectancy and GDP, the number of goods you produce? So those are the examples. How do you add up the fact that we're destroying the environment and the climate with what is going on in GDP? And that's why we said we ought to use a dashboard where we have physical metrics in some things and dollar measures in others, and some areas where we try imperfectly but try to balance things. So for instance, one of the big issues is sustainability. And one way of looking at sustainability is what is happening to the wealth of the country. So the example that was mentioned before, when you have a disaster, you know, and in recent years, the United States, weather-related events related to climate change have been destroying about almost 2% of GDP every year. I mean, it's a big number, $300 billion a year. And the reconstruction increases GDP. But the balance sheet is negative because we destroyed lots of assets, that $300 billion that we lost, and the GDP is just trying to catch us up to that. So these are all examples of that highlight that you can't use a single number, you can't hope to describe anything as complex as our society in a single number, but metrics can help. But you have to be very careful what your metrics are, and that you try to include all the things that are relevant. So let me talk very quickly about one issue, just for a few minutes, and turn it over to Jean-Paul. One of the motivation issues that was very clear at the moment our report came out in 2009. Our original report came out in 2009, and it was the middle of the crisis. And it was very natural for us to start thinking about how do our metrics affect how we think about responding to the crisis. So some governments, I won't mention which ones, but focused on only the liability side. They said deficits matter. GDP was going down, so tax revenues were going down, and the response to that was austerity, cut back expenditures. Now, any reasonable economic analysis, which does not exist in all countries, but in any would say cutting back on expenditures, austerity is going to decrease GDP even more and won't lead to recovery, and it's going to have a negative effect on tax revenue. So that was very clear. But what we wanted to emphasize was there are lots of other aspects of what were going on that we were leaving out of our calculus. And if we had focused on those more, we would have been even more against these austerity policies. So in some countries, like Greece, the effects on the health status of the population was enormous. Life expectancy went down, the increase in poverty, the increase in inequality, education got interrupted, human capital. And so we try to develop a comprehensive framework for thinking about all the things that we don't measure when the economy goes down and when you impose austerity that affect the ability of the economy to produce in the future. So the GDP, as we conventionally measure, just looks at what's happening today. But if you destroy the health of the population, if you destroy the education, the human capital, if you destroy the learning is really the basis, and a lot of the learning is from working, and if you don't have jobs, you don't learn from those work experiences. All of that really means that countries like Greece, future potential growth is much lower. And you can talk about this as we use the word missing capital, that the trajectory, the economic trajectory of Greece will be permanently lower as a result of what the Troika did in Greece. And you could measure the amount that their growth path was shifted down as if it were a of a large amount of capital. And if we thought about that destruction of capital, you say that's really a foolish policy. The cost of austerity are much greater, let alone topics we're going to talk about later about the insecurity, the sense of well-being of the population.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Martine. Thank you, François. Thank you, Yann. Thanks to the OECD, and thanks also to Sciences Po, because we have to remember that the first commission was created thanks to Sciences Po. The natural house of the first commission was OFCE. So it was something which is a collaboration between Sciences Po and the OECD. So it's normal that we are here. No? People can't live without at least the hope of progress. Have we a measure for progress? We have a measure for GDP, but GDP is not progress. And I can give you an example where GDP has increased and where progress has decreased. The country of Trump, I mean, with the increase in inequalities. But that, I mean, I'm joking, but that has happened in many countries, where you had at the same time a decrease in social progress and an increase in GDP. So the metrics we should use is a metric that reflects what is happening to social progress. That was the backbone of our study. And we scrutinized this metric to develop, and we found, of course, the question of equality, the question of equality of opportunity, of equality horizontal or vertical. We found the question of trust. We found the question of well-being. I mean, we are not speaking la novlangue, the new speaks, we say, because, you know, when you read books on happiness and so on and so forth, you think that we are out of this world. No, no. We are in this world, and we are observing what is going badly in this world. And the central question we have to ask is simple. Is what are we aiming at? The growth of what and for whom? And we are not good to have developed metrics to answer this question. I remember when I was working with Pierre-Rosan Vallon on the new age of inequality, we were struck by the fact that there was a richness of data, an enormous richness of data, and less understanding of the way society was functioning. And this movement has augmented in a terrible way. For example, how can we understand France or the US if we don't take into a relationship the geography? From where were the Gilets jaunes coming? And who have elected Trump? So that are things we know we can measure. It's not impossible to measure. And if we don't do that, people will not recognize himself in the statistics which are given. And finally, they would have the impression that the government is lying. And the government may well be not lying. Some are lying, but some are not. Well, maybe not lying, but how can you recognize yourself in an average when inequality is very important? You have the same average between 1 and 19 and between 10 and 10. But that are fairly different situations. And it has become a common observation that people living in the same country have a totally different appreciation of the state of the economy, as if they were living in different countries. And in a way they are. Some are in the 21st century, some are living in the 70th century. So to understand what is going on in the economy and society, we must focus on other metrics. And these metrics are metrics of well-being, and we know that we have two approaches for well-being. The objective approach, which was developed by Amartya Sen, and which was grounded on objective determinant, which allow people to be free to take the decision to live a life that they prefer to live. And but we also develop the subjective well-being approach, because it is a very productive approach, and it is not opposite but complementary to the objective approach. And we have now the new research have found that there are relationship between some indicator of subjective well-being and what will happen in the economy. And the problem now that we are confronted with is policy. And if we take, as Joe has underlined, it's not by chance that we are repeating the same thing, Joe and I, because on this we think the same thing. So if we consider what is the core of European policy, not Mr. Trump, but Madame Merkel, it's the public debt. If you want to have an economy sustainable, you have to have a sustainable public debt. That is the the essential feature of European economic policy. But as Joe underlined it, if you look at just public debt, but not at the wealth of nation, without considering the other kind of capital you have, human capital, natural capital, social capital, and economic capital, if you don't take into account this asset, you may well end with an economy becoming poorer because the decrease in public debt achieved through austerity policy has destroyed more capital, but it has saved some public debt. And has destroyed the essential capital for tomorrow. I mean, social capital, trust, equality, human capital, natural capital, because when you consider only the spending aspect of a problem, you don't spend on preserving natural capital. Why have we the impression that we are just continuing hearing the same discourse about the fact that we should be good for the next generation? Now the next generation is doing the discourse itself. I'm thinking of Greta. But it is something that lead to a situation that if we don't measure, which may be much worse than the situation from which we start. But not only for that, also for its social consequences. I will take just an example. If you don't take into account some factors in a policy decision, you will end with a wrong policy decision. If you want to have a reform pension, and if you don't take into account of a difference in life expectancies of a different category of workers, you will end with an unjust, totally unjust reform. Because some would benefit during 30 years, some during 1 year, and some not even 1 year. So if you consider that to save on spending, you have to decrease the generosity of a system of unemployment benefit, well, you increase economic insecurity. And if you increase economic insecurity, you decrease trust. So all this shows how the work we can do may be of a great importance for not only the people, but for the way policy is designed and for the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Perhaps because I think we're going to speak for too long and would not leave you enough time for... No, I'm not saying that, Jean-Paul. But I think I'm going to illustrate what Jean-Paul said with two charts that I'm going to flip through very quickly in this presentation, just to show you what he just said about health inequalities. There is a chapter in the book on what we call horizontal inequalities, which are inequalities across population groups, which have perhaps the same income or the same characteristics, other characteristics, but between men and women, between elderly and young people, or between immigrants and non-immigrants. And here is a chart that we have produced at the OECD, which shows life expectancy for men at the age of 25 and at the age of 65 by education level. So you have the big blue bar that is at 25, a life expectancy at 25, and the light blue, which is life expectancy at 65, and that's a gap between the high educated and the low educated people. And on average, for the OECD countries, this gap at 25 is about 8 to 9 years, meaning that a person your age, essentially, 25 years old, a bit older, years of age, who has a high level of education like you, can expect to live 9 years more than someone who is less educated, that has a lower than secondary education. In countries where you have a health system, almost, except in the US, a full coverage, universal coverage of the health system. This is a very, very big inequality, huge inequality in our countries, which then illustrates what Jean-Paul says. When you design a pension reform or when you design a health reform, if you don't take that into account, then you wouldn't take into account the fact that some people are living longer and others not. The other chart I wanted to show you is the one that we have on inequality or economic insecurity. This shows the probability of someone, again, in the different OECD countries, to lose 25 of their income from one year to the next. And you can see that in many countries, this, and in OECD countries, this probability is very large, meaning that, almost 25% on average of the population, of working population, has a risk of seeing from one year to the next their income decreased by 25%. This is a huge drop in their income. And what happens for these people? You can see that, so that's a population that is at big risk of facing economic insecurity. And if we look at this chart, it shows, I'm not going to go into the detail, just if you look at the bars, they show the people that are income poor, the way we measure it. On average in the OECD, 12% of the people are income poor. But if you look at the share of the population that is income poor and economically vulnerable, that means that they don't have 3 months of assets in case there is a drop in their income in front of them to avoid that they fall into poverty. This is 40% on average in the OECD countries. So there are 40% of people who are economically vulnerable. So 12% poor, but 40% economic vulnerable. This is, again, a huge number. So we have, and this is only for 1 year. We don't have statistics that show that over the year, across population, who are the most at risk and so on. So again, very important to measure this sort of situation and having much better measure of insecurity. Again, if you know, in the middle of the crisis, if you don't take into account that by perhaps austerity measure, not replacing some replacing some of the transfer revenues, people may face this sort of situation. That was just to illustrate. Another topic that was discussed is the inequality of opportunity, which is also something that is very important, and I'm going to give the floor to Jean-Paul, François.
No, I can't.
No, François, Jean-Paul has already spoken. François.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. Thank you to Sciences Po and to the group who manage this high-level reflection group. You have understood now that the thrust of this exercise is really to build a dashboard of indicators that will allow us to look at several aspects along which we would like to measure progress and the well-being of the population. Among all those dimensions, one which is absolutely key and recognized as such is inequality. And you'll find in the report inequality dealt with in different ways. Standard inequality measure, as you can read it in the newspapers more or less every day, in terms of how much does the top 1% get out of the total income of the households, but also other dimensions of inequality. And I want to talk about one particular dimension of inequality, which is inequality of opportunity. Now, why do we need to make distinctions between different types of inequality? Basically because in terms of policy, we will not be using the same instruments depending on where we want to act on inequalities. Inequality of opportunities, what is it? It is basically the inequality in the circumstances that are beyond the control of people, who may be imposed to them when they were children, and they cannot change, or because they were born in some part of the country or outside the country, because they were born in some specific social area or in some geographical area, they cannot change that. And maybe this will be following them during the whole lifetime. Or maybe not during the lifetime, maybe only during a foreseeable future. But this is something which is given and they cannot change. Now we may oppose that concept of inequality to inequality of outcomes, say earnings, say consumption expenditures, say income or standard of living. And this is what we usually measure through our standard inequality measures. And the point is that the inequality of opportunities are feeding into the inequality of outcomes. When we see people who are unequal in terms of earnings, part of it may be due to their efforts. Maybe some of them have not worked so much and were not so much interested by earning income. But part of it is due to the fact that some of them were born in a favorable social background and are benefiting from that. And it is because the opportunities somehow are determining the inequality of outcomes that inequality of opportunity is something so important. We may correct inequality of incomes by redistributing, by taxing some people and by transferring the money to others. Okay. But we may also correct inequality of outcomes by trying to correct the inequality of opportunities, by trying to somehow diminish the influence of social background or parental background on the career of individuals. And this is what inequality of opportunity is about. Now, I already say why it matters. There is a lot of literature in philosophy, in particular in all this area of social justice, between people who are saying that fairness is about equalizing opportunities, and others who are saying fairness is about equalizing outcomes. This is a very important debate. I don't want to get into that. I want to be much more practical. We are interested in analyzing inequality of opportunity because it is a key driver of the inequality of outcomes, earnings, income, consumption, expenditures. We want to study inequality of opportunity because, and this is something which has not been very much emphasized until now in the literature, because it may be one important perceived inequality in the population. More and more today, when I'm trying to reflect on the Gilets jaunes in France, these days, what is going on in Chile, I'm very tempted to say, the real point there, those people are complaining about inequality, and they're right. But it may not be the inequality that we have in mind, the fact that some people are earning more or less than the others. What they have in mind is inequality of opportunity in terms of how much can they do with the circumstances they are facing. And this is true in many societies, and this is the reason why it is important to be able to motivate, to act on that type of inequality. And finally, I think it is important to keep in mind that because there are inequalities in accessing facilities, income-generating facilities like credit, like a good education, like access to the to the appropriate circle of people, then because of that, there are talents which are not being used. And typically, you are in the right part of the population, but you have to think about people who were as talented as you are, but could not get into a university, could not get through higher education, basically because the parents didn't have the resources to pay for that, even in a country where there is no tuition fee. So this is the reason why I'm interested by inequality of opportunity. So quickly, let me simply say something about how to measure it. It is difficult because we don't observe all the circumstances. We don't observe whether somebody was raised in a family where the key value was effort and or was doing well in school. We cannot observe that. So we are really a bit lost. We can only observe a few things. We can observe the education of the parents. We can observe the income of the parents. We may observe the area where people were raised, but nothing else. So because of that, the way in which we can measure the inequality of opportunity is necessarily limited. And there are two ways. One way is we observe directly some opportunities. We observe the inequality of inheritances. We observe the inequality of cognitive abilities as it is measured, for example, by this well-known OECD survey called PISA. And we also may figure out what is the impact of some circumstances on the inequality of outcomes. And this is what I want to show you to illustrate the point. This is basically research, and one of the problems that we're facing is really that very much of what has been done in this area is still research, and this chapter in the report is very much oriented toward trying to translate research into practice, into generating statistics in a regular way that will enlighten, that will facilitate policy. In this chart, what you can see is the following. On the horizontal axis, you simply have inequality of outcomes, let's say income per capita, household income per capita, in various countries, mostly OECD countries plus a few Latin American countries. And on the vertical axis, what you have there is how much of the inequality that we have on the horizontal axis can be explained by parental background. And in all those countries, we were able to find surveys where there was information on the parents of the respondents, and we were able to take into account the education of the parents, the age at which the respondents, I mean, the parents of the respondents had the respondent, something about the wealth of those parents, etc. And this is more or less uniform across countries. Unfortunately, it is not completely uniform. And what you see here is a big variation that we have among various countries. If you have very good eyes, then you can read the countries. If you don't have a good eyes, I can explain to you which are the countries at the bottom on the left and which are the countries at the top on the right, and you will not be surprised. At the bottom on the left, you'll find the Nordics. You'll find Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway. They are there. These are countries where there is a low level of inequality, and at the same time, very little that is being explained by the parental background. So very little inequality of opportunities read in that way. And at the top, in the top and the right, you'll have mostly Latin American countries. So you'll have Mexico, Brazil, etc., where we have a lot of inequality. But at the same time, a lot of that inequality is essentially transmitted from one generation to the next through the parental background. And here you see that if you want to do something on the inequality of income today, then probably you have to do something about trying to prevent the circumstances where, when those people were born, the families where they were born, to this inequality to translate into more inequality during the lifetime. And this is telling us something about what policies should be about. Of course, educational policies from that point of view are absolutely crucial. Okay, I don't want to take too much time, so this is another curve which is more or less the same curve, but instead of having on the vertical axis the percentage of inequality that is explained by a set of parental background characteristics, you have on the vertical axis what we call the intergenerational elasticity of earnings. So you look at panel data and assume that it is possible to observe the parents, the fathers, let's say. This is very often, sorry about the gender correctness, but in the literature it is very often fathers and sons. But probably, and I may explain why, but it would take too much time. So what you have is simply the relationship between the earnings of the fathers when they were 35 and the earnings of the sons when they were 35. And the elasticity on the vertical axis is by how much does the earnings of the sons increase when the earnings of the fathers increase by 10%. And when you see 0.2 for the Nordic countries, you see that 10% increase in the earnings of the fathers translates into 2% increase in the earnings of the sons. And at the very top, well, again, you'll find some Latin American countries. You'll find that this ratio is 0.6, so 10% is being translated into 6%, a huge intergenerational immobility rather than mobility. Okay, so I want to finish on this. I will not say anything about this last slide, simply to say the following about what could be priorities. We could, the first slide, the first graph I have shown is something that can be developed without any problem. It's easy to do. We almost have the information to do that on a regular basis. And if we were to do that, we could follow over time the way in which our societies are changing. And one might have the feeling that this parental background impact on inequality is something which is reducing over time. There are many reasons to believe that it is exactly the opposite, which is going on in our societies. I don't have time to reflect on this, but this is the reason why such statistics are important. We can also systematically use statistics on the inequality in cognitive abilities, that it comes from surveys like PISA. I will finish on that. I think that the way in which we thought about opportunities until now, in the literature, in the research literature, is very much about lifetime opportunities. The way in which what happened to people when they were kids is affecting their whole career. And it is only recently that we are realizing that opportunities is something which is not necessarily on a lifetime. Opportunities may be current opportunities. And this is where the Gilets jaunes, and this is where the Chilean, this is where the Trump voters are maybe struck by the importance in their own country by the inequality of opportunities. For the moment, we don't have good instruments to measure that, but I would say that given what we observe today, this is probably a very important direction in which we should do more research. Thank you.
The clicker. Okay. Now I'm going the floor to Professor Yann Algan, who is going to present the work that he's been doing on trust and the chapter that is in actually beyond the chapter, because you've continued to work on trust, Yann, right?
Thank you very much, Martine. Thank you to the School of Public Affairs and to Sciences Po with OECD for the organization of this conference, and thanks to all the students for being here tonight with us. So yes, I would just take a follow-up on one additional dimension that has been analyzed in this report, and which is related to social trust, to the quality of social relationship between human beings. So let me first start by just a simple question on why is it the case that trust matters, and why was it so crucial for us to have a specific look at it. It has been a while, since like 3 decades, that sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and also economists have really showed the importance of trust, of the quality of social relationship for explaining growth. And I just give you one illustration here with the picture behind me, where we measure with standard question in international social surveys like the World Values Surveys. On the x-axis, you have the share of individuals within different countries that will say that they could, to the question, do you think you can trust others, or we should always be too careful with others, will say, yes, we can trust others, people we meet for accident, for instance, on the street. Okay, it's really generalized trust towards people that you don't know personally. And so here in different countries, you have the share of people, of trusting people, and on the left axis, you have the level of income per capita. And as you can see, there is a strong correlation. There has been a lot of different papers and research showing that there is a causal link. The higher, the more trusting is the society, the higher will be the level of economic development. And the first one in economics that has really stressed this relationship is the Nobel Prize, Arrow. He was pressed by all the journalists, the economists, to say, when he received the Nobel Prize, what is the miracle for explaining economic growth, and how can you explain the inequality of the economic development across countries? And he really surprised everybody by not mentioning innovation or human capital or physical capital accumulation, but just generalized trust. And by saying what is one of the key drivers of the difference of development across countries is the extent to which you can trust others, because without trust, there is no economic exchanges between human beings. And you find exactly the same kind of correlation when we measure trust in institutions. But as you have understood, this report is not about GDP, it's about going beyond GDP. And the reason why we were truly interested on new measure of trust is precisely because trust is found to be even more important to explain social outcomes, well-beings, crime, educational outcomes, and more generally, your level of happiness. And this is what I report here. You have the correlation between life expectancy and the share of people who trust in others, okay, on the left bottom. And here the same thing with life satisfaction. And so living in a trusting society increases a lot the level of life expectancy, but also your level of happiness. How can we explain this correlation? And this correlation has been found to be really a causal link. Let me distinguish two kinds of trust. In this report, we try to distinguish trust in others and also trust in institutions. The first way to explain this relationship is really related to the level of trust that you have in others. We are social human beings. Joe, François, Martine, and Jean-Paul have stressed somehow how, to what extent, inequality is key for explaining also the quality of social relationship. In a society where you really distrust others all the time, when you compare all the time with others, with your stepbrothers, with your nephews, with your colleagues at work, with your neighbors, the level of happiness is really low, okay? What really matters to understand happiness is not the absolute income, but the relative income, or the relative situation that you have compared to others. So this is the key explanation, the first key explanation. And then there is a second explanation for understanding this relationship between trust and well-being that has much more to do with trust in institutions. What Martine really stressed earlier on was the role of economic insecurity. There is a really strong relationship between the level of economic insecurity and your level of dissatisfaction. And it used to be the case, obviously, that in all countries, you were really vulnerable to risk, especially risk of death, okay? Think about pre-industrial societies where, due to weather fluctuation, plague, eruption, you might have died for this kind of natural disaster. But you would have thought that those natural disasters will be beyond the power of human beings. And this is how religions, myths were created as a way to really dampen your anguish, your anxiety against those risks. Now, in post-industrial society, those risks are created by human beings. Think about global warming, think about inequality, think about the probability of losing your job. So your ability to trust not a God, but to trust institutions, public institutions, in their ability to take care of this risk and to dampen this risk will really actually explain your level of anxiety in your life. And this is precisely why the big and the dramatic decrease of trust in institutions since the last 2 decades might be a key explanation of the rise of populism and of discontent of the population. Here I show you the dramatic drop of trust in the federal government in the United States, but let me just give you a simple correlation of the relationship between distrust in the parliament in national institutions in Europe and the probability that you will vote for anti-system party. Okay, so the lower is the level of trust in national parliament or in national institutions, the higher will be the probability that you will vote for an anti-system party, might it be from the radical left or the radical right. And when you look at the yellow vest, the yellow vest were even more distrusting national institutions than the previous voters of Marine Le Pen or of Mélenchon. Okay? And what was really in common in the voters of anti-system parties or in the yellow vest was precisely this really high level of distrust in institutions and the ability of institutions for preventing economic risk and protecting them from economic risk. And precisely when you look at the financial crisis, let me just take the financial crisis and a key illustration of how economic risk can increase the level of distrust that you have in institution. Here, from a paper that we have with Sergei Gourier, an economic professor at Sciences Po, we show here on the left axis the difference in voting for the extreme before and after the financial crisis, and here on the x-axis the difference in employment, so the variation in employment before and after the financial crisis. And you can see that precisely in those European regions where the increase in employment has been the highest, the higher will be the probability of voting for a populist party. And what is quite dramatic in this financial crisis is that the middle class or the working class not only blame public institution, experts, elites of not being able to prevent this crisis, but also from not having been able to fix the crisis during at least one decade, especially in Europe, with dramatic consequences in terms of poverty and inequality in countries like Greece. There's also another key relationship is between inequality. So François has talked about inequality of opportunity. Here I just measure inequality with the Gini, and a strong negative correlation between the extent of inequality and the extent of generalized trust that you have in others. In more unequal societies, it's much more higher to trust others. And I will just conclude here on what will be the key policy recommendation. The first policy recommendation will be precisely to have much better measures of trust. Here, as you can see, we have measures of trust at the country level or at the regional level at most. But if social relationships really do matter, we really need to integrate in our traditional National Institute of Statistics really detailed measure of the level of loneliness, the level of social relationship, and at a really high frequency level. The second thing is, in terms of policy, what kind of policy recommendation we can have? The first one is really simple, is really to prevent also economic risk. As you can see, for instance, for the financial crisis, and I go back to one argument that Joe have mentioned, is that there is a missing link, even when it takes a long time to create and to build trust. You need to have also educational policy that are really favorable to the increase of trust. But when a country is hit by an economic shock, trust is destroyed, and for a really long period of time. Even after the economic recovery in most European countries, the level of distrust in institutions has remained really, really salient. Okay, so this is the first thing. The second thing is also, obviously, you might have policies to try to create a social contract, and especially to fight against inequality. And this is a key element. But I will add one additional thing, one additional element. The main concern in a society and in our modern times where distrust is really a silent feature of our society, is that distrusting people are not in favor of redistributive policies. And in general, the voters of Marine Le Pen, of Trump, of Salvini, in favor of the Brexit, are not really in favor of redistribution because they distrust not only the rich, but they also distrust the poor. And so one additional policy that you have also to have in mind is how you can really sustain or develop trust, and especially trust at work, trust in different localities. And I will just give one illustration. I take the opportunity to have you have here also you have the chief of the advisory board of the economic advisory board of the Prime Minister, Philippe Martin, and I hope you will have him as a professor, or it's maybe already the case, but we are writing with him a report for this advisory board on the yellow vest. And what was the event that could really explain at the geographic level the emergence of the yellow vest? And we showed that obviously it was related to the feeling of loneliness in those Middletown areas where there has been a loss of a lot of public services, but just of places of socialization. I don't know the translation of bar PMU in English. Joe, maybe you can help me on this. But you know, simple restaurants, simple bars, local bars where people can meet. Precisely in localities where those places of socialization have been removed are also the one where the feeling of loneliness has been the highest and where the probability of demonstration in favor of the yellow vest has been the highest. So this needs a new agenda, and this is precisely the goal also of this commission and this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. And in fact, Jan, you didn't show that last chart that this is work you've been conducting with some people at the OECD, which is the lab, an experimental lab that introduces some behavioral aspects or experiments. And on the red, you see for 7 countries for which we have conducted these experiments, the determinants of people's trust in public institutions, and in blue, trust in interpersonal trust. And if you look at the determinants of people's trust in institutions, the number one is actually essentially corruption. If people feel that the government is corrupt, then they will not trust any institutions. But the other ones are actually access to services, to education, health. Do they have quality services and so on? Are they taken care of by the government? And if you look at interpersonal trust, the number one is actually neighborhood connectedness. So loneliness. So this is really an illustration of what Jan just said. So to conclude our presentation, we're not going to spend time on that, but we argue very strongly on a better use of those well-being metrics in public policies, and we do some kind of a report on case studies of what countries are doing, and we cite a number of countries that have moved, and we want to in particular, talk about New Zealand, which has adopted its first well-being budget in 2019, where they are really put their mouth where their money is, because the Prime Minister has said that well-being was the number one priority on the agenda of her government, and any new reform or new policy that is being presented by a department, be it education, labor, whatever, is screened with respect to well-being indicators and whether this will increase the well-being of New Zealanders, not whether it will increase GDP. So that's a great advancement. We're following this very carefully. There are other examples that you will find in the book. We've been very long. We've been bombarding you with a lot of information. So we hope that now you will ask many questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot to everybody. We have time for a lot of questions. So please, if you want to ask a question, can you actually move to the different microphones on the left and the right? Who want to start? Yes, but yeah, sure. Start, and we can take a couple of questions at the same time. Huh?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you all very much for speaking to us today. I just have a question specifically referring to what Professor Stiglitz was discussing, which is the idea of sustainability when it comes to going beyond GDP. What kind of indicators should we be using when we're trying to encourage policymakers to take more action on the climate crisis, for example? How should this debate be better framed?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. We can hear you.
We can hear you. Okay, thank you. Right. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. This distinguished panel is very, very interesting. And I'd like to ask a question. Climate change has already been mentioned as one of the major world problems. The other one, I think, is the prevention of conflict, because we have a global situation which is unprecedented. And as you well know, about 1.7 or 8 trillion is spent each year on arms. And I wonder if in your future studies, or perhaps in this, you are taking into consideration the wastage, not only of human lives, but of the destruction of countries, resources, etc. In other words, the human and the social loss from war, which is absolutely amazing. It's understood that it takes about 5 to 10 years to rebuild nations. It's a complete waste of time and humanity. And so I wondered if you have been or are planning to integrate this type of metric in your studies. Thank you very much. It's been analyzed, not by some United Nations organizations and civil societies working on the peace area, but it would be great if a distinguished panel like yours did something on this.
Thank you very much. Joy, you want to start?
Okay, those are all great questions. Let me begin with sustainability. And we talked about all dimensions of sustainability: economic, environmental, social sustainability, and basically a lot of what Jan was talking about was sustainability in terms of political and social, and the aspects that we are not capturing as you create more distrust. And that really is, a theme underneath that is kind of sustainability. What we were effectively talking about when we were talking, Jean-Paul and I were talking about the issue with response to the recession, was in the period before the recession, GDP was going up, but it was based on a real estate bubble in the United States and in Spain. That was clearly not sustainable. And yet almost nobody talked about what was going on in terms of the economic unsustainability of what was going on. And they identified, some people were talking about unsustainable imbalances in international trade, but that wasn't what brought the world economy down. It wasn't what they were focusing on. It was more of what the unsustainable allocation of resources and the unsustainable financial sector. The key issue I agree with you raising is the climate crisis. And there is no easy answer, and that's one of the reasons I said in our dashboard, we talked explicitly about using physical metrics like the increase in greenhouse concentrations in the atmosphere, because there's a lot of uncertainty. There's some uncertainty about how those increases in concentration translate into climate. There's uncertainty about how those changes in climate are going to translate into GDP and to wealth. We could go through and do all those calculations, and I think it's important that we do that. But a shortcut of saying how bad things are going is looking at the increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That tells you 90% of what you really want to know. And so since those other steps are things we should be understanding, focusing on that physical change, I think, is really the critical dashboard. And to put it another way, adding that in, that decrease in wealth into GDP would subtract attention away from the issue of climate. We really want to focus explicitly on the economic consequence, on the consequences of climate, of which economics, the normal of GDP, is only one part. So that was explicitly why we took that dashboard approach. The second question is something that we hear a lot, that GDP is a useful indicator. And my response is, what does one mean by useful? I would say it's a misleading indicator. Politicians love it because it's a number that they can grab a hold of. They like it when it's going up a lot. When it's going down, they look for other things. But it has a simplicity that people like. But the point that we've been emphasizing over and over again, it is an indicator which is potentially very misleading. And so that means it's not that useful. It's interesting that the person, the economist behind the regional calculations of GDP was Simon Kuznets. And he explicitly warned that it was not a good indicator for well-being or welfare or normative purposes. It is a measure of market activity. And one of the things that's been going on in our society is a movement from non-market activity to market activity. But that means GDP is going up faster than well-being. The obvious example that we gave in our original report are something like if, and actually Paul Samuelson used to talk about this, if he marries his secretary, his babysitter, let's say a divorced parent, marries their babysitter, with who he had previously paid, and that babysitter now does that work for free, GDP goes down. Now, nothing real has happened. I mean, something real may have happened, but that physical act of marriage and changing from a monetary to a non-monetary transaction decreases GDP. But no, the real activity is going on. So that really highlights that it can be a very biased. And I guess what we want, the thrust of our report is to make people think about these issues and to try to think about, is there a underlying distortion in the way we're measuring? And we've identified a whole set of big distortions. So one of the things, this is another, you sometimes hear that GDP isn't adequately capturing all the value that all of you who were looking at your cell phone, iPhones, as we were talking, and not paying attention to what we were saying, that the utility that you were getting was not being captured in GDP. And so you sometimes say here that, therefore, GDP is underestimated. But the real fact is, once you start including the things that we've all talked about, inequality, horizontal inequality, trust, climate, insecurity, I come away with the judgment, and you can't prove this very strongly, but the judgment that our GDP is actually grossly exaggerating increases in well-being. And that's particularly strong in countries where you used to have a good system of social protection, and that over the last 10 years, that system of social protection has been enervated, and that really captures. Can I go? Do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I want to jump in. I mean, we need some contradiction in this panel. No, I mean, I don't have any contradiction with what you just said, but I don't think that we want to give the impression that GDP is absolutely useless.
That's right.
I mean, if we want to measure, as it was said by this student, if we want to measure the evolution of productivity in a given sector, and we know that it is quite important to know that, even only to know what will happen with employment, then we need GDP. So let's make sure that there is no misunderstanding because of this. GDP as a measure of welfare, we completely agree, and this is really the thrust of this report. There is a big problem with it, but we can use it in a very, very well-defined manner, and it is useful from that point of view.
Yeah, and perhaps I can concur with François. In fact, it's because we don't use GDP for what it was supposed to be, used as well. I mean, it's not just a mismeasurement, but it's also a misuse of GDP. So we use it as a welfare indicator, which is not. But to be fair also to our national accountants, I represent the statistical community here, so I have to defend them to some extent. But there's lots of work that's going on in the international community among national accountants, so national accounts, to create what is called satellite accounts. So there is currently a satellite account that is being built on unpaid household work, or satellite accounts on education, on health, and so on and so forth, and even on the environment. And the idea is to link these different satellite accounts to expand GDP, but not to replace GDP, because as François just said, GDP per se, and it's imperfect and everything, but it is also useful for some uses, but not certainly not as welfare. But it's just to say that there is a lot of activities in the statistical community to improve GDP.
If I can jump just a word. GDP is a partial reflection of what we want to observe, of what we see. So, for example, GDP can be a good measure if nothing happen in the field of capital. If you have no crisis, if you have no destruction of capital, so gross evolution of capital would be acceptable. GDP also is a good indicator as it is related to directly to unemployment. But the problem is that could we have a trade-off between something like GDP and something like the social protection system? We believe that we could. We believe that when we decrease the social protection system, the people will work more, but is that an increase in well-being?
Okay, so let me answer very briefly.
Yeah,
the last question. I wanted to say a word about, because I thought that was very important, and actually the problem is even worse. The question was about conflict, and it is very similar to the point that was made earlier, that when we spend a lot of money repairing from a hurricane, we don't talk about the damage, we talk about the expenditure to repair the damage, but we're worse off. So just to give you one number, in the United States, will be spending the present discounted value of expenditures just for the healthcare and disability payments of the troops coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq is now over $1 trillion. But those expenditures, particularly the healthcare expenditures, are part of GDP. Mm-hmm. And, you think about the devastation of the lives of those people who, over 50% of the troops coming back have multiple disabilities. And yet our GDP goes up because we have to spend so much to give them prosthetics and other things to make. So that's, there's a broader issue of what is called defensive expenditures. It's not just protecting, the trillions of dollars that you talked about in defense expenditures. We don't enjoy that. It's, not something that really makes us better off. It just protects us from something worse happening. A very large, when you think about our society, particularly a society there's no trust, you have to spend a lot on security guards. That's part of GDP. If there's an increase in distress and a worry about crime, you spend more on security guards. GDP goes up. But is your well-being increased? Clearly not. So one of the things that would be important for us going forward is to try to extract from our numbers how much of what we're spending is defensive in this very broad sense, and even worse, the offensive, but the defensive, that are not adding to our well-being, just preventing us from being worse off.
Okay, thank you very much. A couple of other questions. Please start.
Thank you. So this will be actually a follow-up to what Professor Stiglitz just said. And we talked about how important measurement is for policy making. So of course there's lots of interest on keeping GDP as it is for many. There is a Spanish economist that talks about necro economy or economy of death, because there are so many interests of so many, as we're explaining right now exactly, about healthcare expenditures in the US, for example, to keep it private, or many more things that don't add to welfare but add to this GDP, to this social gain that we say is GDP. So how will you then confront to this many powerful that want to keep GDP be the norm? Because it's great that we talk about alternatives, but how can we make these alternatives possible?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, and short question, please.
Okay,
Right.
thank you very much for this great discussion. My question leans more toward policy rather than measurements. As you know, last month OECD hosted a conference on putting well-being measures into action, and I had the chance to participate in that conference, and I asked a question from Professor Sachs and Madame Durand along with other panelists, and I want to ask the same question from this panel. It has been widely debated and Professor Stiglitz, you have been very active in this debate on the role of government versus market in development and fight against poverty policies. I was wondering, how is the role of government in well-being policies, especially in comparison to development policies and growth policies? I'm asking this because we often assume that the targeted group of countries for development policies are very different than well-being policies, and a lot of government intervention in development context is justified by poor institutions, which is not the case for countries interested in well-being policies.
Okay, a short question. Okay, thank you. Can we take two additional one? Yeah.
So my question is really short. When we have so many ways of measuring how an economy could be doing well and why are policymakers not picking up on it? Because it's not rocket science to understand that if life expectancy is declining, an economy can't be doing well. So why is nothing happening?
Thanks a lot. The last one, and we'll try to have a second one, a third one, okay? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. So my question is about politics and academia. So right now in the UK, there are general elections, and Jeremy Corbyn, who stands for against inequality of outcome, inequality of opportunity, he's being written off. Jeremy Corbyn, he's been written off as a Marxist. There's this whole bias against left-wing politicians, left-wing academics. I wanted to ask you, how would he make your policy suggestions popular? How would he make people want to support redistribution, inequality of opportunity? And as academics, do you face similar resistance because of are you seen as radical, or do you face other kinds of are you written off as being too extreme with your suggestions?
Thank you very much. Who wants to start?
You want to begin with the development? Okay. Well, maybe let me first let me say I'll distinguish myself from my colleagues. I don't view myself as radical. I view myself as very center, and I view a lot of the other people as extreme on the right. Let me. But there were several questions about the process of political acceptability. And one of the first slides that Martine showed, and one of the themes about all our work, and one of the reasons I accepted to be on the first panel, the first commission, was that we wanted to raise these issues in part of democratic dialogue. And our belief in democracy was that if you can have intelligent discussions, if you can get better data, it will affect not only the policymakers, but the public dialogue. And the reaction, somebody said, you know, the last question, if people really knew that life expectancy was going down, if that became more known, I think they would say something's going wrong. You know, it's not because there's a disease going around, and it's not one of the aspects of that Angus Deaton has brought out. It's the main, white Americans. It's not minority groups. It's not, you know, it's in some sense people that have. It's not migrants. It's not any other, but it's the core. What many people would think of as the. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, what I wanted to say, maybe on the last question, is the fact that as academics, we may think about ways of improving a society, and it may be the case that policymakers or decision makers will not agree with the kind of policy that is recommended based on the kind of indicators that we suggest that we should produce in a systematic way. But the point is that if those indicators, if the policies which come with those indicators are somewhere on the table, they have been expressed, they are in part of the public debate, this means that at some point of time, these ideas will be picked by others who might try to implement them. And the role from that point of view of academics is not necessarily to tell policy or politicians, this is what you should do, and if you don't do that, you are not a good politician. Certainly not. Politicians also have many, many other things to take into account when they are making a decision. But the role of academics from that point of view is simply to make sure that ideas are on the table. And ideas must be relying on evidence, on the kind of indicator that we are proposing.
But perhaps, again, not to disagree with what you said, but one thing that, you know, health expectancy, life expectancy is an indicator that's been published for years and years. So it's not to say that politicians or whoever didn't have this data. They had this data. I mean, it's not new. What we're saying is that that's why, and I'm answering the question on the dashboard, GDP comes every quarter, bing, every quarter you have this data. So people focus on this because A, it's timely, and it tells you something about the state of the economy. But if you have a dashboard, which is much more comprehensive, and you put GDP at the same level as education quality, health, life expectancy, inequality, and so on, all at the same time, and then you make policies, and every quarter or every year, you have your dashboard that gives you a much more comprehensive picture of the state of the country, not of the economy, of the society and the country. Then you can see that you make the trade-offs, the synergies more explicit. You can say, oh, the country grew, but look, health expectancy decline, life expectancy decline. And by the way, the environment, CO2 emissions became even worse, and inequalities increase. Then you have the full picture. The problem is that by having this kind of partial picture, by just looking at GDP, you don't have the right diagnosis. You have some of it, but not all of it, not all at the same time, not all at the same frequency. Some data on inequalities are 2 years old. So what can you make out of it? So there is a big statistical agenda, information agenda, not just for policymakers, but for civil society. And this should be part of a regular dashboard that is published regularly to inform civil society, citizens, and policymakers alike.
Yeah, let me just say, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just one word. Right. It's, would the policy vis-à-vis the Greek problem would have been the same if beforehand, the government knew that infant mortality would increase by 43% between 2010 and 2014. I hope not, but I don't know.
So,
I don't know the answer. But that is a question we have to confront.
Let me just make two examples of the power of these numbers and responds a little bit to the special interest. The first example was when, under President Reagan, inequality started to increase. What was the administration's first response? To try to stop collecting data on inequality. Because that is the best way of solving the inequality problem is just don't know about it. The second one was when I was in the Clinton administration, we decided to try to calculate a green GDP. It was sort of like a satellite account, but to do a correction for resource depletion and environmental degradation. And we knew that we were onto something important when the senators from the coal state, the congressman from the coal state, said that if we continue to do work on this, they would take away all of our resources and all of our money. They realized that if people knew that what coal was doing to our green GDP, to our more comprehensive GDP, there would be popular opposition to coal. So their response is not to allow us to formulate that measure. And so I think the fact that people respond so strongly is at least indicative that at least some people are worried about the power of numbers.
There is only 5 minutes left, so what I suggest is we can pick up the 4 last questions in 30 seconds each, and we'll have 3 minutes to respond. Okay? Go ahead.
So considering the negative impacts of GDP growth and especially its correlation with CO2 emissions, to what extent do you think that degrowing developed economies according to GDP is permissible or even desirable? Or in short, do you believe in green growth, green GDP growth?
Okay, thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Good evening. You said repeatedly that we tend to miss the forest for the tree when we do measurements, yet we still need some time to have an economic metric. For example, if you tell someone to walk, the same person will respond to you for how much. And so if you want to encourage a more comprehensive understanding and consideration of well-being, how can we put monetary value on it and derive concrete actions from it?
Okay, thank you.
Really short, my question is considering like the study of more of a stock dynamic that rather than inflows, would you think that inequalities are underestimated right now?
Okay. The last one.
Just to you, Professor Algan, I'd just like to ask your views on how trust fits in the concept of social capital. Is it roughly the same? I just couldn't quite see how that fits into the literature. And to Professor Fitoussi, the one topic we haven't touched on today is the financialization of the global economy. Markets, especially allocating capital to debt markets, do look to GDP as a fundamental indicator of the sustainability of economies. Does that mean the entire financial system is wrong? And how can we approach that? Thank you.
Okay, so if you want, I will have a short answer because before the main conclusion to just say that trust is one element of social capital, but trust is much more related to the belief and to a certain extent to the positive side of social capital. Social capital include also the extent of social relationship, of networks that you have, for instance, civil society, civic associations that are one additional element. But the only issue, the reason why people really, to a certain extent, focus on trust is that in trust, you still have, to a certain extent, a positive element. This hope to invest in a relationship with others to have a beneficial outcome. Social capital might have a negative outcome. Social capital was high in some Nazi association of Germany, and so on the mafia, and so this is why we do make also this distinction. Joe, maybe you...
Okay, let me just try to answer the question about degrowing the economy in the light of the concerns about climate change. My view is we did an analysis with Nick Stern, and we had another commission where we asked the question, is it possible continue growth and move to zero net emissions? And the answer was yes. So I don't think, but what is necessary is we have to change the nature of our economy, change the nature of our growth. And I think you asked the question in the right way. It's very, if you asked me whether I need to have my income grow every year, the answer is no. I could take I could take one of the 25% cuts that Martine talked about, and I'd still be okay. But when I think about the people in poverty, and particularly in developing countries, who do not have access to adequate housing, clothing, I can't say we have to stop growth. So the real question is the balance between the developing countries, emerging markets on the one hand, and the developed countries, but also within the developed countries, because there are these huge inequalities that the data that we brought out illustrate.
About the question on the financial sector, we had a long discussion during the Commission to know if it is an intermediate product or a final product, because we thought that the financial sector is supposed to be at the service of the economy. So an intermediate product, it's not contributing by itself to the wealth of the economy. Maybe for the part which is exported, but not for the one which is consumed in the country. So the question remains. The question remains, but it is really politically incorrect if you say to the bankers that they are producing an intermediate good and not a final good.
Maybe a word on the last question about putting a monetary value on some of the indicators that we mentioned. I don't think this is really possible. Right at the beginning, Joe Stiglitz said that we were not in favor of simply modifying the accounting of GDP. When you were referring to green GDP, this is more or less what green GDP is doing. It is using a set of prices which is not the same as the market prices. Now, it may be possible when you deal with carbon and carbon emission. It may not be possible when you deal with other elements, other indicators, like trust, for example. How do you value trust? So I think that we should avoid going in that direction, but that does not mean that we cannot do economic calculation. I mean, we know something about inequality. We know something about whether inequality is favorable for the dynamics of an economy. We know this kind of thing, and we may analyze the trade-off that there may be between different goals, but we don't need necessarily to get into monetary values all the time.
Yeah, just two words. The question on stocks versus flows for looking at inequalities, I think that's a very good question. And in particular, for instance, if you just looking at economic inequalities, we all know that inequalities in wealth is much higher than inequality in income. So it is very important. And looking at actually the joint distribution of income and wealth is also something that is very important to consider. So yes, the answer is yes, and it would be true for other types of assets, of capital, if you wish. And then I concur, just a word on monetization. There's been lots of attempt to actually monetize, but you don't, I mean, when there's no market, it's very difficult you have to estimate prices, and I don't know who asked the questions. Let me give you an example. Non-household production, household production that is non-market production, like taking care of your children, of your elderly relatives, and so on and so forth. If you want to integrate it into GDP, you have to give a price to this, or a wage to the person who is actually carrying this type of activities. Are you going to use the wage of what you would find in the market wage, if that person was doing this work in the market, like taking care of children, or is it going to be the opportunity cost, a mother staying at home, usually mother, I'm sorry to say that, but it's often the mother, staying at home to take care of the child and having some foregone wages? Do you use that wage? If you make this sort of assumption and you add that to GDP, you can have differences going from 10% to 100% of GDP in some countries. So which one do you take? That's very complicated.
Okay, this is with this puzzling question that we will end this session. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody.